After enough time spent questioning everything I have inherited, it would be easy to assume I've ended up with nothing left standing. That's not quite what happened. A handful of rules survived the scrutiny, and what's interesting is how differently they feel now compared to before I examined them. They used to feel like obligations. Now they feel more like agreements I keep making with myself over and over because I still believe in them. Take something as small as how I start my mornings. There was a version of that habit I inherited without thinking. Wake early because that's what productive people do, because someone once told me idle mornings were wasted ones. When I finally put that rule on trial, I expected to discard it. Instead, I found something underneath the inherited reasoning that was actually mine. I like the quiet of an early morning. I think more clearly before the world starts asking things of me. The rule survived, but the reason for keeping it changed completely. That distinction matters more than it might seem. A rule you keep because you were told to, and a rule you keep because you've tested it and found it true are structurally identical from the outside. Nobody watching me wake up early could tell the difference. But from the inside, they're entirely different experiences. One is compliance dressed up as discipline. The other is something closer to self-respect, a promise I keep making to a version of myself I actually want to become. We don't talk enough about what it means to choose a rule on purpose after having the option to walk away from it. There's something sturdier about a discipline that survived doubt than one that's simply never been questioned. The rules I keep now aren't the ones I've never examined. They're the ones I've examined most closely and decided deliberately to keep carrying forward. I think of things like how I handle disagreement, pausing before I respond instead of reacting in the moment. I didn't inherit that one from anyone in particular. I built it slowly after watching enough of my own reactive moments cause more damage than the disagreement itself ever would have. It's a rule I set for myself, tested against real situations, and kept because it kept proving useful, not because some authority handed it to me and I never thought to check. There's also a kind of freedom in having rules like this, which might sound strange given everything I've said about questioning structure. But a rule you've chosen on purpose doesn't feel restrictive the way an inherited one does. It feels more like a tool you built for a specific job, one you can set down the moment it stops working and pick back up the moment it's useful again. The structure isn't a cage in that case. It's closer to a set of hands you trust, shaped by your own experience rather than someone else's assumptions about what you should need. So when people ask whether all this questioning eventually leaves you with nothing to stand on, I don't think that's quite right. It leaves you with less, but what remains is sturdier. There's a quiet confidence that comes from this kind of foundation, one I didn't expect. When you're standing on rules you chose deliberately, you don't need to defend them the way you defend something borrowed. You're not protecting your ego or someone else's expectations. You're just standing on something you've already tested, which means challenges to it don't feel like threats anymore. Someone can question my morning routine, my way of handling conflict, whatever it is, and I can actually consider what they're saying instead of getting defensive, because I already know why I chose it in the first place. The rules I keep now aren't inherited weight I've simply gotten used to carrying. They're the ones that survived being tested, examined, and chosen again, deliberately, honestly, on purpose, which is a different kind of foundation than the one most of us start out standing on. There's a particular way of seeing that comes with spending years as an analyst. You stop looking at things as they present themselves and start looking at what's underneath them. The structure, the assumption, the quiet decision someone made a long time ago that everyone downstream just accepted as the way things are. Once that habit sets in, it doesn't stay confined to a job title. It becomes the lens you carry into everything. I remember noticing it first in small, almost embarrassing ways. Reading a menu and wondering why the prices are arranged the way they are. Watching an ad and catching myself reverse engineering the persuasion instead of receiving the message. It felt strange at first, like I was somehow outside the moment I was supposed to be inside of. But over time, I realized this wasn't a glitch. It was just what happens when you train your mind to ask what's really going on here for long enough.
We're surrounded by systems we didn't design and rarely examine. The way meetings are structured, the way a family handles conflict, the unspoken rules of a friendship, of a workplace, of a whole industry. Most people move through these systems the way water moves through a pipe, following the shape without questioning why the shape exists. An analyst's eye doesn't let you do that as easily anymore. You start noticing the pipe. That awareness comes with a cost, if I'm honest. Once you see the architecture behind something, you can't fully unsee it. A conversation that used to feel simple might reveal itself as a pattern you've watched play out a dozen times before, in different rooms with different faces. It can make you feel a step removed from things that other people experience effortlessly. There's a kind of loneliness in seeing structure where others just see life happening. But there's also a gift buried in it. When you notice the pattern, you get the chance to interrupt it. You can choose a different response instead of running the default one. You can ask why a habit exists before deciding whether to keep it. That's not cynicism, it's agency. The eye that questions is also the eye that opens up options nobody else in the room even knew were there. I've started to think of it less as a professional skill and more as a relationship with reality itself. We're taught, most of us, to accept the surface, to take the menu, the ad, the meeting structure, the family script at face value, because questioning takes energy and social risk. But once you've spent enough time asking why is this built this way, you can't fully go back to accepting things simply because they exist. The question becomes part of how you perceive, not just how you work. What I'm learning is that this way of seeing needs care, though, or it can tip into something exhausting. Not everything requires excavation. Some things really are just what they look like on the surface, and treating every moment like a puzzle to be solved can leave you tired in a way that has nothing to do with insight. The skill, I think, is knowing when the analyst's eye serves you and when it's all right to simply let a thing be a thing. Still, when I trace it back, this way of seeing has given me more than it's taken. It's shaped how I build my own life, noticing which structures around me actually serve me, and which ones I've just been standing inside of out of habit. The eye that questions everything at work turned out to be the same eye that questions everything else, and I don't think that's an accident. I think it's just what happens when you finally start paying attention.
Somewhere along the way, we all pick up a set of rules we never consciously chose. Don't talk about money. Be polite even when you're upset. Success looks like this specific shape, and any other shape is somehow less. Nobody hands you a document explaining these rules. They arrive quietly, absorbed from a household, a culture, a handful of formative years until they start to feel less like rules and more like facts about the way the world works. I've spent a lot of time lately trying to separate the two, the rules I actually chose and the ones I simply inherited without ever putting them on trial. It's harder than it sounds. A rule that's been running in the background for 20 years doesn't announce itself as borrowed, it just feels let you. The test I keep coming back to is simple, even if it's uncomfortable. When you notice yourself following a rule, you ask where it came from. Not in a vague sense, but specifically, whose voice is this? A parent's, a teacher's, some cultural expectation absorbed from 100 small moments you don't even remember individually. If you can trace it, you're already halfway to freedom from it, because a rule with a known origin is a rule you can finally choose to keep, adjust, or set down. Some of what we inherit turns out to be worth keeping. That's important to say, because this isn't really about rejecting everything handed down to us. A lot of inherited wisdom exists because it worked, tested across more lives than just our own. The goal was never to burn it all down out of principle. The goal is examination, keeping what still holds weight and being honest about what's just been coasting on inertia. But some rules don't survive that kind of scrutiny. We carry ideas about what a successful life looks like that were shaped by people who were themselves reacting to scarcity or fear or a version of the world that no longer exists. We inherit a fear of rest because someone once needed to work constantly just to survive, and that urgency got passed down like a family heirloom nobody remembers gifting. When you finally ask, why does this rule exist?
Sometimes the honest answer is, it doesn't. Not for you. Not anymore. There's a particular kind of relief in that discovery, and also a kind of grief. Relief because you realize you have more choice than you thought. Grief because letting go of an inherited rule can feel like letting go of the person who gave it to you, even when that was never really the intention. We don't always get to separate a rule from the love it arrived wrapped in, and that makes the sorting process slower and more tender than it might sound from the outside. Still, I think this sorting is some of the most honest work a person can do. Not performative rebellion, not rejecting things just to prove independence, but a quiet ongoing audit, asking of each rule you live by, did I choose this, or did I just never think to question it? That question alone starts to change things. It puts you back in the driver's seat of a life that might have been running on autopilot for longer than you realized. We inherit so much without asking to. Bodies, habits, beliefs, the shape of what we call normal. But rules are one of the few inheritances we actually get to renegotiate, if we're willing to look closely enough at where they came from and whether they still serve who we're becoming.
There's a version of change that looks like growth, but isn't. You rearrange the furniture in your life, a new routine, a new hobby, a new city even, and for a while it feels like movement. But if you're honest with yourself, sometimes it's just motion, activity standing in for direction. The scenery shifts, but nothing underneath actually changes. I've caught myself doing this more than once, chasing novelty because stillness felt uncomfortable, not because the novelty itself meant anything. A new system, a new schedule, a new way of organizing my mornings, all interesting on their own. But if I trace the thread backward, sometimes the honest reason was simply that I got bored of the old one. Boredom is a real signal, but it isn't the same thing as purpose, and confusing the two can keep you spinning for years without ever landing anywhere. Meaningful variation feels different when it's actually happening. It comes from a question, not a craving. You notice something isn't working or isn't quite you anymore, and the change that follows is an answer to that specific noticing. It has a reason you could explain out loud if someone asked, one that isn't just, I was tired of the old way. There's a kind of clarity to it, even when the change itself is small. We tend to romanticize reinvention. New year, new city, new self, as if change is automatically virtuous simply because it's changed. But a life built entirely on switching things up can end up just as stuck as a life that never varies at all. The person hopping from interest to interest, system to system, isn't necessarily freer than the person who's been doing the same thing for a decade. Sometimes they're both avoiding the same question. Does this actually matter to me, or am I just moving to avoid sitting still with myself? What I've started asking before making any real shift is simple. What is this variation actually in service of? Is it solving something real, revealing something true, or is it just noise dressed up as progress because noise is easier to generate than insight? That question alone slows me down in a useful way. It doesn't stop change, it just makes sure the change is mine, chosen for a reason I can stand behind later. There's also something worth saying about rhythm here. Meaningful variation doesn't have to be dramatic. Sometimes it's a 5-minute adjustment to how you start your day, made because you noticed something small and real about what wasn't working. Other times it's a much bigger shift, a whole structure rebuilt from scratch. The size of the change isn't the measure of whether it counts. The measure is whether it came from attention or from restlessness wearing attention's clothes. We live in a culture that often celebrates change as an end in itself, as though stillness were failure and constant reinvention were proof of growth. I don't think that's quite right. Growth sometimes looks like staying exactly where you are, having already asked the hard question and found that the current shape still fits. Other times it looks like tearing something down entirely. What matters isn't which direction you move. What matters is whether the movement was actually born from something real or just from the itch to feel like something was happening. I think about it now almost like tending a garden rather than redecorating a room. A garden doesn't change for the sake of change. It changes because something is ready to be pruned, or because the season has genuinely shifted and the old arrangement no longer serves what's trying to grow.
You don't rip everything out just to feel productive. You watch closely, and you adjust where the watching tells you something real is happening. That kind of attentiveness takes more patience than constant reinvention does, but it produces something that actually holds. So when the urge to change something rises up in me now, I pause long enough to ask what's underneath it. Sometimes the honest answer is boredom, and I let the urge pass. Other times the answer is real, and the change that follows feels less like escape and more like arrival, like I finally caught up to something true about me. That's the version of variation worth trusting, not motion for its own sake, but movement that finally matches what's happening underneath.
Every relationship comes with a script nobody writes down, but everyone somehow knows. The friend who's always the one who listens, the family member who plays peacekeeper no matter the cost to themselves, the partner who's supposed to be the strong one, the steady one, the one who doesn't need anything back. You slip into these roles so early and so quietly that by the time you notice you're wearing one, it can feel less like a costume and more like your actual personality. I've spent time lately questioning the roles I've been handed in different relationships, and it's uncomfortable work. Not because the people who handed them to me were cruel or manipulative. Most of the time, they weren't even aware they were doing it. Scripts get passed along the same way habits do, absorbed rather than chosen, reinforced every time you play your part well enough that nobody thinks to ask if it actually fits you. You start to notice it in small moments. A conversation where you automatically become the calm one even though calm isn't what you're actually feeling. A pattern where you're always the one who reaches out first, apologizes first, smooths things over first. And you realize at some point you never actually agreed to that role. It was just assigned, and you accepted it so gracefully that nobody, including you, ever registered a negotiation had taken place. We tend to think of relationships as something that just happens between two people, organically, without architecture. But there's architecture everywhere in them. Unspoken rules about who initiates, who forgives faster, whose needs get named out loud, and whose get quietly absorbed into the background. Being subversive here doesn't mean tearing the relationship apart. It means asking, honestly, whether the role you're playing was ever actually chosen or whether you just grew into the shape the relationship handed you. This kind of questioning can feel risky in a way that questioning a workflow at work never does. A process doesn't have feelings about being examined. A person does. When you start to shift out of a role you've played for years, speaking up instead of smoothing over, asking for something instead of assuming you shouldn't need it, the people around you notice, and not always kindly. Sometimes a relationship was quietly depending on you staying exactly the same, and any subversion of that script gets met with resistance before it gets met with understanding. But I've started to think that's part of what makes it worth doing. A relationship that only survives because one person keeps performing the same fixed role isn't as solid as it looks. It's more like a structure held up by a single unmoving beam. Real closeness, the kind that can bend without breaking, has to be able to survive someone changing the part they've always played. If it can't, that tells you something true about what was actually being held together in the first place. So now, when I catch myself falling into an old role out habit, the fixer, the strong one, the one who doesn't need much, I try to pause and ask whether I'm choosing that or just repeating it. Sometimes the answer is that the role still fits, and I keep playing it on purpose instead of by default. Other times, it doesn't fit anymore. And the harder, more honest thing is to let the people around me see a version of me that isn't running the old script. That's where the real relationship starts, underneath whatever we'd both been performing until then.
Compliance is easy to underestimate because it rarely announces itself as a loss. It doesn't feel like giving something up in the moment. It feels like relief. You stop questioning the process, the expectation, the way things have always been done, and something in you exhales. No more friction, no more second guessing, no more standing slightly apart from everyone else who already agreed to go along with it anyway. For a while, that feels like peace.
But I've started noticing what quietly disappears underneath that relief. Every time you accept a system without examining it, a small muscle in you goes a little softer. The one responsible for asking, is this actually right, or am I just agreeing because agreeing is easier? That muscle doesn't announce its own weakening. You only notice it's gone when you try to use it somewhere else and find it isn't there anymore. We tend to think of compliance as neutral, almost virtuous, following the rules, staying in your lane, not causing trouble. And there's a version of that which really is just good citizenship, cooperation, trust well placed in a system that's earned it. But there's another version that's quieter and more costly, where compliance isn't really trust at all. It's just the absence of the energy required to ask a harder question. You can watch it happen at a large scale too. A team stops questioning a broken process because the process has been in place long enough that questioning it feels disrespectful somehow, as if raising a hand is an accusation rather than an act of care. A family stops questioning a dynamic that's clearly hurting someone because the dynamic has calcified into tradition, and tradition gets treated as though it's beyond examination simply because it's old. In both cases, what's actually lost isn't the system, it's everyone's collective willingness to look at it honestly. What worries me most is how compliance compounds. The first time you go along with something you privately doubt, it costs almost nothing. But each time after that gets a little easier and a little quieter until the doubting voice inside you stops showing up at all. Not because it was answered, but because it learned nobody was listening to it anymore, including you. That's the real cost. Not one bad decision, but the slow erosion of the part of you that used to ask questions in the first place. I don't think the answer is to distrust everything by default, treating every system as guilty until proven innocent. That's just a different kind of exhaustion, and it isn't really freedom either. It's reflexive opposition standing in for actual discernment. The goal isn't constant resistance. It's staying capable of resistance when it's actually warranted, keeping that muscle alive enough that it still works the day you genuinely need it. So now, when I notice myself agreeing to something a little too easily, I try to ask whether that agreement is trust or just fatigue wearing trust's face. Sometimes the honest answer is that the system deserves my compliance, and I give it freely, without resentment. But other times the honest answer is that I stopped questioning simply because questioning got tiring, and that's a different thing entirely. I think about the people who've influenced me most, and none of them were defined by blind agreement or by constant refusal. They were defined by a kind of ongoing attentiveness, a willingness to keep checking even after they'd already said yes once. That's harder than picking a permanent stance and holding it forever, because it means never fully getting to rest in either compliance or rebellion as an identity. But it also means staying awake inside every decision instead of running on the momentum of an agreement made years ago that nobody's revisited since. Knowing the difference between real trust and quiet fatigue and staying willing to look for it again and again might be the only real defense against losing the part of you that used to notice when something wasn't right. That part of you doesn't disappear all at once. It fades slowly, in small moments of easy agreement, until one day you can't quite remember the last time you asked a system to prove itself worthy of your compliance at all.
After enough time spent questioning everything I have inherited, it would be easy to assume I've ended up with nothing left standing. That's not quite what happened. A handful of rules survived the scrutiny, and what's interesting is how differently they feel now compared to before I examined them. They used to feel like obligations. Now they feel more like agreements I keep making with myself over and over because I still believe in them. Take something as small as how I start my mornings. There was a version of that habit I inherited without thinking. Wake early because that's what productive people do, because someone once told me idle mornings were wasted ones. When I finally put that rule on trial, I expected to discard it. Instead, I found something underneath the inherited reasoning that was actually mine. I like the quiet of an early morning. I think more clearly before the world starts asking things of me. The rule survived, but the reason for keeping it changed completely. That distinction matters more than it might seem.
A rule you keep because you were told to, and a rule you keep because you've tested it and found it true are structurally identical from the outside. Nobody watching me wake up early could tell the difference. But from the inside, they're entirely different experiences. One is compliance dressed up as discipline. The other is something closer to self-respect, a promise I keep making to a version of myself I actually want to become. We don't talk enough about what it means to choose a rule on purpose after having the option to walk away from it. There's something sturdier about a discipline that survived doubt than one that's simply never been questioned. The rules I keep now aren't the ones I've never examined. They're the ones I've examined most closely and decided deliberately to keep carrying forward. I think of things like how I handle disagreement, pausing before I respond instead of reacting in the moment. I didn't inherit that one from anyone in particular. I built it slowly after watching enough of my own reactive moments cause more damage than the disagreement itself ever would have. It's a rule I set for myself, tested against real situations, and kept because it kept proving useful, not because some authority handed it to me and I never thought to check. There's also a kind of freedom in having rules like this, which might sound strange given everything I've said about questioning structure. But a rule you've chosen on purpose doesn't feel restrictive the way an inherited one does. It feels more like a tool you built for a specific job, one you can set down the moment it stops working and pick back up the moment it's useful again. The structure isn't a cage in that case. It's closer to a set of hands you trust, shaped by your own experience rather than someone else's assumptions about what you should need. So when people ask whether all this questioning eventually leaves you with nothing to stand on, I don't think that's quite right. It leaves you with less, but what remains is sturdier. There's a quiet confidence that comes from this kind of foundation, one I didn't expect. When you're standing on rules you chose deliberately, you don't need to defend them the way you defend something borrowed. You're not protecting your ego or someone else's expectations. You're just standing on something you've already tested, which means challenges to it don't feel like threats anymore. Someone can question my morning routine, my way of handling conflict, whatever it is, and I can actually consider what they're saying instead of getting defensive, because I already know why I chose it in the first place. The rules I keep now aren't inherited weight I've simply gotten used to carrying. They're the ones that survived being tested, examined, and chosen again, deliberately, honestly, on purpose, which is a different kind of foundation than the one most of us start out standing on.
There's a restlessness that lives underneath all of this questioning, and for a long time I treated it like a problem to solve. Why can't I just settle? Why does some part of me keep circling back to things I thought I'd already figured out, reopening conversations with myself that felt closed the week before? I used to read that as a flaw, something anxious or unfinished about how I'm wired. Lately I've started to see it differently. That restlessness isn't a malfunction, it's closer to a form of maintenance. The same way a gardener keeps returning to a plot of land that already looks fine, because looking fine and actually being well tended aren't always the same thing. The mind that keeps circling back isn't broken, it's paying attention. We're taught to associate peace with stillness, and there's truth in that most of the time. But there's a different kind of stillness that isn't peace at all. It's just neglect wearing a calm expression. A relationship you stopped checking in on, a belief you stopped testing, a version of yourself you stopped updating. All of that can look perfectly still from the outside while something underneath has quietly gone stale. Restlessness, the kind I'm talking about, is what keeps that staleness from setting in unnoticed. You can feel the difference between the two kinds of restlessness once you know what to look for. There's an anxious restlessness that just wants relief, that circles a problem without ever actually engaging it, more concerned with escaping discomfort than with learning anything. And then there's a quieter, more deliberate kind, the return that has a question attached to it. Is this still true? Does this still fit? Am I still standing behind the choice I made, or just coasting on the fact that I made it once? That second kind isn't anxiety. It's care, just wearing a less comfortable outfit than we usually expect care to wear. I think this is part of why I've stopped trying to talk myself out of it.
When I noticed myself circling back to a decision, a relationship, a rule I thought had settled, I no longer assume something is wrong with me for not being able to leave it alone. I ask instead what the circling is actually pointing to. Sometimes the answer is nothing. The thing really is settled, and I could let the loop close. But sometimes the circling is right, and it's caught something worth catching before it calcified into neglect. There's a cost to this kind of attentiveness. I won't pretend otherwise. It would be easier in a lot of ways to simply decide something once and never look at it again. Certainty like that is restful, but it's also a little bit false because almost nothing about a life stays exactly as true as it was the day you first decided it. People change. Circumstances change. The rule that fit perfectly 2 years ago might be quietly working against you now, and you'd never know it if you'd stop checking. So I've made a kind of peace with the restlessness instead of fighting it, not by giving it free rein to spiral through everything endlessly, but by trusting it as a signal worth listening to rather than a flaw worth silencing. It's the part of me that refuses to let anything, even things I care deeply about, calcify into something I'm no longer actually paying attention to. That doesn't feel like anxiety anymore. It feels like one of the most caring things I do for myself.
2 words started this: subversion, subversiveness. Small words to carry this much weight, but somehow they did. Through a day job that taught me to question systems, through rules I inherited without ever choosing, through relationships built on scripts nobody wrote down, through the quiet cost of going along with things I never actually examined. Looking back now, all of it was really the same question, asked in different rooms, wearing different clothes. Is this actually mine, or did I just never think to check? The analyst's eye was where it started, at least the version of it I could name out loud. Learning to see the structure underneath things, a meeting, a habit, a belief, instead of just accepting the surface. That eye didn't stay at work. It followed you home the way any real way of seeing eventually does, until it touched everything from the rules you grew up with to the roles you've been playing in your closest relationships without ever agreeing to them. Some of what that eye found was worth keeping. That matters because none of this was ever really about tearing everything down. We sorted through inherited rules and found some of them true, tested by more than just our own experience. We looked at the disciplines we'd built for ourselves and found a handful still standing, not because we were told to keep them, but because we chose them again, deliberately, after doubting them honestly. That's a different kind of foundation than the one most of us start out with. But some of it didn't survive the examination, and that was worth something too. The compliance that turned out to be fatigue instead of trust. The relationship scripts that were never actually chosen, just inherited and performed well enough that nobody thought to question them, including me. Letting go of those wasn't loss in the way it first felt like it. It was more like finally putting down weight I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it wasn't mine to begin with. And underneath all of it was the restlessness, the part of me that kept circling back, rechecking, refusing to let anything settle into unexamined comfort. I used to think that restlessness was something wrong with me. Now I think it might be the most honest form of care I have. It's the reason none of this ever fully calcified into certainty. It's the reason the questioning never really stopped, even after 9 segments of trying to name what it's actually been doing all along. If there's a single thread through all of this, it's that subversion was never really about rebellion for its own sake. It was about the staying awake inside a life, instead of sleepwalking through one built by other people's assumptions, other people's fears, other people's versions of what a good life is supposed to look like. Some of what we inherited turned out to be worth keeping. Some of it needed to be set down. The only way to know the difference was to keep asking over and over instead of accepting either answer permanently. So maybe the real practice was never about finding a final answer at all.
Maybe it was about staying willing to ask the question again every time something started to feel a little too automatic, a little too settled, a little too much like something you'd stopped actually choosing. What rule are you still carrying without ever having checked where it came from? And what would it feel like to finally put it on the table and look at it honestly?